Okay, we're going to take a look at Yggdrasil and the World Tree, and its symbology and stuff. Think of Yggdrasil in some ways as being like the king of the redwoods, if you will. And you know how big a redwood is. They've got them where you can drive cars through. So a lot of times they're depicted like you see in this picture here as having some kind of a magic going up on its branches, and you see dragons flying all around it. And indeed, some of the stories tell you that dragons dwell amongst its branches, and then deep down in his roots there's an evil dragon that lives there. It's kind of like a Tiamat and Bahamut situation, if you will. And these dragons up here are supposed to be an offspring of like Tia, or the earth, and then there's the underworld, and the cause and the reason for rumblings of the earth and earthquakes and stuff, which, man, for seemed to happen a whole lot after the end of the last ice age and finally quelled off, and a lot of volcanic activity too that's quelled itself back again quite a bit, but still shows a lot of rearing its head every once in a while, and people still have big fears of things like that. But that's not what this is about. Although a volcano god does contain some of the same concepts with this down in the earth bowels thing, vomiting up and so on, but that's for other videos here. This world tree concept is more of a earth mother type of concept, and something that goes along with nature and mother nature, and along that concept, and people living in harmony, and magic groves and trees, and stories of elves and things go, of course, along with it real well whenever you play like Dungeons and Dragons and all the games like that. And indeed, what scares me somewhat is that the mythology and all this that I'm learning and passing on and telling to people becomes very rarely learned by people nowadays. And it seems like how they can get some of the knowledge out of games like God of War or something, and somebody will try to contest me on how something went because of something they heard from maybe some video game. Or, of course, Dungeons and Dragons had a lot of people that really went into depth, but of course they adapted it for gameplay and things and didn't touch on certain aspects, of course, and so on. So let's just go ahead and get into this, and I'll diverge as I normally do. The Norse legend of the World Tree in Yggdrasil. In 1643, a bishop called Brynolf Svensson was given 45 pieces of vellum containing poetry and prose from the heart of ancient northern European and indigenous cultures. God, I'm botching that. This collection is called the King's Book, or Codex Regius in Latin. So, Regius being king. It is thought to have been written around 1270. Between 1270 and 1643, the manuscript was hidden from public view, presumably to protect it from being destroyed by the new religion which arose from Rome, and of course Greek before that. A precious ancient manuscript, who the family was that protected this manuscript over 300 years, we don't know, nor do we know their tradition, but we can be sure that it would have been a treacherous secret to bear safely through the medieval centuries with everything that went on. The bishop did not himself keep this manuscript. Instead, he offered the collection as a gift to the King of Denmark. There it remained in Copenhagen until 1971, when it was returned to Iceland. I've got another video I might as well release about this same time, probably before or after, gosh, I don't know. And it talks about the Redskin books, and that there's 3 codexes that go with it, and there's other mentions of this book. So, ancient manuscripts that are not well known and hidden. And why were they hidden for so long? Well, because it kind of shows you a difference to it. And they thought so much of tradition that warships had to transport the manuscript across the sea, as a plane journey was seen as too risky, and such was the preciousness of the papers, and of course the symbology of them doing it. It is not surprising that these vellum papers represent the few written remains of our indigenous past of northern Europe. And so when we open these old scripts, we find at the heart of the Norse mythology, contained within a symbol as archaic as campfire, the world tree, Yggdrasil. And so you have instantly here being told you the connections of course, fire and wood and things, but how things go together, and of course, fruits of these trees that are, either fruits themselves or really acorns and nuts and so on, that there's a plethora of that we have nowadays, which really can sustain people over a long period of time. And so folklore arises around out of ancient people coming from ancient times, getting expounded upon and so on. Here's a quote from it. I know that an ash tree stands called Yggdrasil, a high tree, soaked with shining loam, for there comes the dews which fall in the valley, evergreen. It stands over the well of fate. And there's, this is called the seeress's prophecy. And so that's a woman. This is a witch's prophecy that was written down. And this is, it sounds like some witch coming up with something they would say, or some lady looking at tarot cards. And indeed, it has to do with something along that line. But this idea of a tree and it springing forth life can see going back all the way to the Sumerians, and probably way, way before that. And these people that lived, of course, in forests, and the ancient stories of elves, which grew themselves from a yew tree. Now, the ancient story, when yew was what's used for the recurve bows and all the badass bows and stuff, and, long bows of old, and that yew, it said that everywhere an elf had died in elder times grew up a yew tree, and that you were supposed to have respect for the forest and everything. And we have forest stories that go, and Sherwood Forest and all these things that go with it and everything. And Johnny Appleseed, which I guess we'll get to here in a moment too, but the dews which fall on the valley, and this tells you that this is the fertilization that springs forth over the earth, almost like the canopy of clouds is made like the canopy of a tree. And whenever a tree rains, and it holds it but drips back down onto people, and that it has this vast range like Johnny Appleseed across vast areas. Now, Yggdrasil and Odin, the most satisfactory translation of the name Yggdrasil is Odin's horse. And strange it would have that whenever horses are really from way far in the east. But nay, maybe not. Ig is another name for Odin, and Drasil does mean horse. However, Drasil also means walker or pioneer. Pioneer or walker. No, maybe not so much walker, maybe explorer or pioneer. Right? Now we get a more idea of these early Caucasians and how they really like to get around and explore, and how Johnny Appleseed might carry with him knowledge as a kernel or a seed that may not show up as a tree, but may show up as a tree. For Abraham planted a tree whenever he came from Ur in a sacred grove. But the Sumerians have the story of Demuzi, now he's reborn out of a tree. And where does this born out of a tree concept come from, and ideas that go with all of this? Well, it comes from before these people, in a common people, which spreads out much further and comes from back into the last ice age easily. Let's look into this a little more, though. So, pioneer or traveler or explorer. Some scholars would argue that the name means Odin Walker. Skywalker. Odin's the god of the sky. That's strange. In some parts of the manuscript, Yggdrasil and Odin seem to be one and the same, and indeed there are always symbologies where he put it together. When you have sun god worship and ideas where there's this one-eyed god in the sky and so on, that there are multiples of that. It happens through Christianity and Judaism, it happens through Mithraism, it happens through Sumerians and everybody really off pretty much, except for, in the Sumerians there's Utu or Shamash, the sun god. And Shamash is the sun god of the Bible also. But then they have An. He's the god of heaven, which originally made everything, but now he is pretty much seen as past. He makes 2 appearances, that's it, and then he is passed only into heaven, and he cannot be seen anymore. And this is, of course, Uranus of Ur, and so he no longer can be seen anymore, but he still has a slight halo around him. Whenever we find the planet, amazingly, they couldn't be seen back then. The most high or farthest away planet that we could find then was Saturn. So, and Jupiter before that, but it's bigger. There was your king, and so on, and this Jupiter comes from Dies Pater, and that comes from an ancient Proto-Indo-European linguistics that comes all the way from India and China all the way across. I've shown that in a lot of videos here recently, but I digress. Let's continue. When Odin hung for 9 days on the world tree, he uttered the words that he had sacrificed himself unto himself. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Well, 9 days is a little too long, isn't it? Well, but you find out if you actually run off a lunar calendar and you left yourself 9 days in between, you'd really be off by 1 day, and every 4 years by 2. Is that the way it works? I think it's real close to that. But anyhow, sacrificed himself unto himself. And so now they're telling you that that is him and that is the world tree, but also you get this idea of the cross and Jesus having sacrificed himself to himself, for he was God, but he was his son, but then Odin, and Odin is the son of, so you get this idea and this reflection. And then the son of Odin is Thor, and he's the storm god. Now this is Zeus, this is Baal, right? Now El of the Bible and the Tempel, the Chapel and the Angel, named Michael or Gabriel, all the El names. El doesn't just mean God. El is the name of the God of all the people in that Canaanite area. And you can't say there was this little spot where, well, it doesn't mean that, it just means a God. No, it's not just God. That's the name of God that's been hidden for so many years. Here's to blow away a fog. Anyhow, this stanza gives us a description of the unity existing between the Godhead and the tree in the myths. To emphasize this connection, we find an Old English word, triau, which both means tree and truth. Etymologically, then, truth and the tree grow out of the same root. And you see that symbology in the Bible used over and over again, and it makes you wonder where it comes from. Well, let's see where some more comes from. Ask and Embla, the first man and woman. Here's another reason this book was hidden. In Norse creation myths, man and woman originated from trees. We are all the sons and daughters of the ash and the elm tree. The first man was called Ask, born from the ash tree, and the first woman called Embla, born from the elm. Their oxygen offers us the primordial conditions for life. Ask and Embla sprouted from Yggdrasil's acorns, and so it is that every human being sprouts from the fruit of Yggdrasil, then to be collected by 2 storks who bring them to their longing mothers to be. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Storks? How about the idea that it comes from acorns? And so what we're looking at here is old Druidic type stuff and things, and oak tree worship, and where it comes from. And another rippling of this Johnny Appleseed effect is there are definitely oak trees in the Americas, and other forms of these trees in the Americas. And do trees of life have to go with trees of life? in different ways in some way or form? Is that what we're led to believe that it connects to? The idea that they give you this shelter around you that you breathe, and that you should stand next to trees if you're ever winded. There are ancient stories of things of people that apparently are like asthmatic or having problems breathing because of sickness, and to go and talk to plants or whatever, and you hope they're not allergic, and that's not the problem in the first place, but neither here nor there. And of course, allergy is a demon against one certain thing, right? In a certain light. So 2 storks though, and then this idea of this fruit of life and this 2 trees that form here too. And then there's Adam and Eve in this story. We're not getting an idea yet. Storks and mothers to be, and then she becomes pregnant. He tells her that she's going to have pain in childbirth. Let's see if there's any more correspondence with this as we go. In Scandinavian folklore, God, I'm botching these words, people. I apologize. They say that children are born through the knot holes in the trunks of pine trees, which is another version of the same myth. But women, if you've ever had a child, I think you would probably say, okay, I get the idea they're talking about. But also there's an old story about birds and bees and everything, and knot holes in trees and birds might live and so on. But then the idea that a woman's area might resemble something like that, or there's connotations that people put on things, and so you can see that idea. But then it's a pine tree, and that's an evergreen, and this is Mother Nature. And then again, cedars and evergreens are all the trees of all these myths, because in the winter they're the thing that stays there and it keeps going. And this is a symbolization of the mother, and we looked at mother goddess worship recently. Anyhow, so let's look at this picture here. And so we're actually looking at Odin, or God, creating Adam and Eve, and then I guess we're looking at Loki there and Thor here. No, other way around. Thor and Loki. So, I mean, is that it? Ask and Imla? Well, Arthur Lundquist is one of the Swedish literature's greatest tree worshippers, and so he's got a lot of tree lore. Following a reflection on trees and forest, he writes, in every human there is a tree, and in every tree there's a human. Well, I guess like in the idea of the yew tree I was talking about. I feel this, the world, the tree wanders inside a human being, and the human being is caught in the tree. I serenade the forests. The forest sea is the second sea on earth, the sea in which man wanders. The forest work in silence, fulfilling nature's mighty work, working with the winds, cleaning the air and mitigating the climate, forming soil, preserving all our essentials without wearing them out. So, this is kind of a tree hugger situation, if you will, at one time, but I think we realize now that sacred forests are really something we have to keep going to, and it's not just it cleans the air. For I've got a great idea. Phytoplankton in the ocean actually eats up more than all of the forest, and not that just justifies cutting down forest. We do need to replant and keep green in cities and around, and try to keep that definitely for global warming effects and just everything else. But it creates this oxygen dome that they had that kind of back then, that the trees did it. Sure, there was other plants, but these really did it. The trees. Maybe somebody who was slightly asthmatic realized this effect. What do you think? I mean, let's delve onto that maybe. Bringing a mini version of Yggdrasil into your home. People represented Yggdrasil by planting what we call a care tree, or a guardian tree, in the center of a homestead, or in an atrium or a foyer. It was a miniature version of Yggdrasil and a stately landmark in the courtyard. The care tree was a figurative expression of interdependence of the world around us, in which had a soul which followed the lives of those who grew up under its shadow and its boughs. And in a lot of cases, people, if they have a new house, they plant a tree. And then as they plant that tree and their children grow up, and you start having these sentimental things as you see that tree get huge, and the kids eventually, second generation, when you're granddad, people are playing in that thing a huge tree now. Maybe even making a tree house and so on, and you'll be like, I remember when I planted that tree. And you can see how this brings about things. But, you could chop down that tree too and make it into a bunch of wood and hopefully not just make firewood out of it. And did you plant a tree? And did your dad plant a tree? And should you plant a tree? Roots. Hopefully you follow what I'm talking about. If the care tree had witnessed many families growing up, the relationship between the tree and the family would have strengthened. This relationship was known to be private and confidential within the family line. Many such care trees can still be seen in Scandinavia. People see a tree of life. They see a family tree. You'll see them draw a family tree sometimes. A sacred family tree was shown in oh God, what is it, Harry Potter and stuff, where they've got the names around onto it and how people connected to each other. Much such care trees can be still seen in Scandinavia. I would argue that this is the origin of the Christmas tree. We unknowingly bring the world tree into our home every winter solstice. And I would add to that the ancient Germanic people definitely knew of this, and Tannenbaum and its ancient stories, and how that sacredness goes with that, and the Celts and the tree worship that went with that. But you can also see that even in the Sumerians, where they had the same ideal, where around on December 21st, the sun got at its lowest point in the sky, near a constellation called the Southern Cross, where it went 1 degree every day. That's where we get our 360 degrees of around of a circle of a ball, kind of like you see here, and not this more looks like the map that you would think of in the Bible, by the way, where there's a flat earth and a sides around onto it. But in that concept of before and through till even now, that the sun dies on that cross or near it, and then 3 days later it starts going back up, and that brings back spring and life. And we just had a video I talked about spring. But there's how Christmas turns it around. I was going to do a video on this at Christmas, and it didn't come to light. I had done, 6 on Christmas already anyhow, and then the end of the year ones and everything else towards it, and a couple of holiday specials. One where I kind of went a little too far, and I guess it got knocked real quick with 2 views. But that's another video entirely. But anyhow, this idea that the Son of God dies on the cross and then rises back again in 3 days, and it does so to save all of humanity, is a story that's really echoes through a lot of religions, if you realize what I'm saying. And you can see the symbology of this snake that's a circle that has grown so large around this world that it is beginning to bite its own tail, like 2 snakes coming together. And there's an ancient belief, and I'll go into farther in another video, about how that's how snakes used to breed and all this other weird things. And snakes were magical creatures, dragons, if you will, and I've done some vid about that recently too. And serpents, and how they come from elder times. And really, if you think about it, all the dinosaurs and stuff, and it's amazing they had this cool little thing that went with it, isn't it? And this underworld idea, and this gate to heaven or hell that you have to go to, and the roots and so on. And that's from 1847, and it's just off somebody who knew stuff, you know, a Gnostic on the side. Somehow they still knew. This is all hidden for a long time and really not allowed to be talked about. It was pagan. Oh, bad, bad juju. And even though you find out, well, it's really the same kind of stuff, isn't it? Anyhow, the fragility of the world tree. We also gain an understanding from the old vellum scripts that the world tree is not a transcendental entity beyond time and space. Whether it's alive, organic, fragile, and strong, and bound by the three dimensions of time, past, present, and future. And these are the fates, if you will. Fragility of Yggdrasil is always a concern to the gods. There's a dragon called the Bane of Biter who bites into its deepest roots or at its feet. And you can see that concept echoed in the idea of Hercules, and then he gets bitten by his feet, or you can see it kind of echoed in the idea of Achilles. But there are also other animals that assist or assail the tree. 4 deer feed from the branches, and their names are Diane or Dane, as in disdain, as in dispatter or disdain, and Develin, and Donair, and Duratro. Now, Dane and Develin are described seeming as if they are dead, or living with indifference, living in a mist, are kind of like zombies a little bit-ish. And the other two are enacting. There's yin and yang, and then there's the others that don't have to interact. I'll leave that alone for now. 2 animals stand on the roof of Valhalla, of the abode of the gods, the goat Hydron and the deer Ike Turner. And not to be confused with Tina Turner. Ike and Tina broke up a long time ago. There was this problem. He had a bit of an issue with his hands, let's just say. And so Ike Turner is alone then. And then they feed from the branches too, but they also give back gifts to the tree. And here we have that gifts coming to the tree that again is echoed in the Sumerians, where they set up a tree in a sacred grove each year for Demuzi, and they brought gifts to it, to the gods. And of course this probably would eventually go to the priests and so on, to be used in some fashion. But at the same time, you see that tree of life that they have gardening indoors in Sumerian, definitely taking pine cones, this evergreen concept, and using it to keep the tree of life going. Now, the goat offers mead, and the deer pours water from its antlers onto the roots. They are both said to give life in the balance with the tree. And there's this ancient story that goes along with this, where a deer in spring gets his antlers and he rubs the velvet off of it onto trees, which shakes the morning dew off, that hits the ground, that feeds the roots, that springs up the flowers of springtime, and a butterfly bats its wings in India, and da-da-da, and you see all that. And here's this depiction, which really is a 4 clusters, 4 stages or 4 stags of Yggdrasil, and the ancient deer concept that went along with this. And of course, whenever you have animals you're following, you have a bond with that concept, and there's going to be a lot of that. And you see the people with the deer head type things, and the cowlings that have it on their heads, and the wise men that use that, and the shamans and so on. Speaking of wise men, the Norns protect Yggdrasil. 3 old wise men known as the Norns, the 3 wise men, they came from the east. The Norns are protectors of the guardians of Yggdrasil. The 3 Norns weave on a loom which represents time itself. They are portrayed as Urd, which is the past, Verdani, which is the present, and Skuld, which is the future.